welcome back to the Church Tech 101 podcast. Today is episode 10, Bits versus Volts. Let's talk about that. I remember when I saw my first digital mixer, it was probably the late 1990s, which kind of makes me feel old at this point, but our college had just gotten a new Yamaha PM1D, and that was just amazing to me. It was like cutting edge of digital mixing. And at home, at my home church, I was mixing on an analog Yamaha, which was kind of an entry-level one. So it was just wild to me, to see the flagship with all the moving faders and buttons and lights and things. I was fascinated. But today, digital mixers are a lot more common. And so we want to talk a little bit about the difference between analog mixers, which are your volts, and digital mixers, your bits. And really, the difference is that analog mixers are entirely electrical. They don't have any digital signal processing. Some of them may have an effects processor, for example, but they don't have any digital processing. It's electrical signal as it comes in, goes through the board, and goes back out again. With a digital console, that signal comes in and gets converted into data, and at that point, it can be manipulated or changed. Digital signal processing is much more powerful because you can do a lot more things in the software realm. And that's really what's happening with the digital console. It is a proprietary computer running proprietary software that lets you process all the audio signals. And then, of course, when they're done processing and routing and sending them wherever they need to go, then you can turn them back into analog and send them out to the power amplifiers of the monitors or whatever you're using. And so why do I want to pick one versus the other? I'll tell you this, I have gotten criticism from some sound guys for even considering putting an analog board in a church. And my response to that is that I don't think the analog boards are dead yet. There's something to be said for the simplicity of analog. And right now I can see an eye roll from somebody, but the nice thing about analog is that everything that you do is on that same surface. There are no hidden menus. There are no hidden settings. An analog board has every control on its surface. And if you understand them, you can look at it and quickly figure out what's going on. I've had plenty of people who have gotten themselves into trouble, or their sound guy has left and they have no idea how he programmed a digital mixer, and I've come in, had to unwrap, or in some cases, entirely reset a digital mixer and set it all back up again for a customer because the complexity was high enough that their volunteers just didn't really know what to do or how to work it. I remember going to a church in Estes Park, Colorado, in a retirement village. And the first time I poked the button on their digital console and their faders moved, they all jumped because they didn't know what it was. And they didn't even know it did that. And the guy who had installed it, of course, was an audio whiz, and he had unfortunately passed away. And so for them, we just put in an analog mixer where I said, if I put something in that has a knob, a button, a fader for everything, and we can put labels on it, how does that sound to you? And they were very happy with that. And so I think for me, analog mixers tend to go for smaller or medium-sized ministries where they don't have a lot of complexity happening. It's a very regular service every week. You have the same things. They're using maybe 3 or 4 microphones. And so for them, a digital mixer is just overkill. And in a lot of situations, it is maybe a waste of their resources to buy something. And that's one of the reasons I started my company, is because I was frustrated with these big AV companies coming in and selling churches seriously complex systems that were way more than they really needed to do what they were doing. I mean, total overkill. But these guys are getting kickbacks, of course, on selling their latest and greatest digital console from the manufacturer. They'll get a spiff, I think is what they're called, but they get some sort of a monetary incentive for selling that particular product. And that really bothered me because I wanted to pick a product that I thought was the right product for that church and that would work well. And to this day, I am not an equipment dealer on purpose because even if you do that, equipment dealers put pressure on you to sell a certain amount of their product. And I don't want to pick a product just because I have pressure behind me to sell that product, but I want to pick a product for a church because I believe it is the correct solution for their ministry. So sorry I didn't go off and ramble on that, but it really does bug me. So let's talk about a couple of pros and cons. What we'll do is we'll talk about the pluses of digital, and then we'll talk about how that works with analog. So the nice thing about digital mixers is that they're very flexible. And for me, a lot of big churches, they are using certain channels. There are different mixers where I can change, build a custom layer that just has the channels that they're using in that layer. And that is fantastic because that means that nobody's tinkering with the other inputs that we don't need to see. We can just build it custom. We can even build a custom user layer for maybe your school. If you have a Christian school and you only need to be able to use like 2 wireless handhelds or something, that's what they're restricted to. We can build a custom layer. We can password protect that. And they can only check out that one. They can only use those 2 microphones on their layer for the school. And then they're not getting in there and messing with all the settings for the church. And of course, the recall on a digital mixer is helpful if you have multiple groups that are using your auditorium. You can recall different settings for different groups without having to reset your board. Now, the key to all that is that these are larger, more complex ministries. For some of you, you're coming in Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and you're using the same 3 microphones. I don't think you need a digital mixer for that. I think a quality analog mixer is going to do well for that. And the complexity can be lower because what you're doing is less complex by definition. Now, one of the things that I see about digital that can be confusing is layers. And this can get confusing for volunteers. The way a digital mixer works is it has one set of controls. But that set of controls can control different parameters. So your faders don't just control your main mix. If you press a button, those faders then can control your piano monitor mix. Or you press another button, they can control your pulpit monitor mix. Or you press another button, they can control your orchestra mix or whatever you're doing. And that can get confusing for volunteers. If they're on the wrong layer, now they think they're changing something or fixing something, but they're actually adjusting the wrong layer. So, especially for older volunteers, the complexity of that can be confusing because they're just used to this button does this thing. However, for younger volunteers, it's generally not too bad. They're pretty good at the idea of menus or layers and that kind of thing because they are the tech generation. And so that can be a plus too because you can get a lot more control on a single surface. You don't have to lay out a knob for every single control, but it can be kind of a soft control that adjusts multiple parameters. But even as an audio pro, sometimes I'll find myself adjusting something on the wrong layer. It just happens. And some of that is just years of me mixing on analog mixers. And I'll just go straight for a fader. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's the pulpit monitor. I need to go back to my main mix to adjust that for the auditorium. So let's see. Are there any other things I wanted to talk about here? I really think analog is a good investment if you're a small church and it's going to be 15 years before you replace something. If your gear cycle is pretty long, analog is generally a good investment because it is hardware. It just works. It doesn't need software updates or whatever. They're not going to quit supporting it. They might quit making it, but they're probably not going to quit supporting it. Not that they need to support it. It's just hardware. And so I think it's a good investment for a lot of smaller churches that are looking for a longer gear cycle. Your larger churches, I mean, really about every 10 years, you should probably be looking at replacing a digital mixer. We have an older Presonus, I think, that we had originally in our main auditorium, and now it's in our chapel. But now it's starting to have some problems where the preamps are making noise on particular channels and that sort of thing. So it's starting to go. And we're going to have to, what we'll probably do is upgrade the main mixer and then in our main auditorium, and then we'll push that mixer over to our smaller chapel. That's just kind of how the gear works at my church, because we have two spaces. One's used for Spanish church and for school and for Wednesday nights, and then the other one's used for Sunday morning, Sunday nights, or whatever. So that is something to think about. I think with digital, you're going to have a shorter gear life. And part of that is the support of that. Will the apps and the software and everything continue to support your mixer, for 15, 20 years? Probably not. At some point, they're going to end of life that. And then you can probably still run it, but you're going to have to run it on old computer hardware, et cetera, et cetera. So it can get kind of messy if you're using the connectivity of your mixer in different ways. Mixing with an iPad, any of that sort of thing. So it's just uncertain, I think, in my opinion. So I try to look at that from a capital investment point of view for churches. Is this going to be a good investment? If you're a larger ministry and there's budget for that to, upgrade that every several years, then no problem. Digital is going to be a great solution for you. So this kind of comes to my last point, which is what should I buy? And I think there are a couple of things to consider. One, how large is your ministry? The larger, more complex ministries, I think, are going to benefit the most from a digital mixer. It's just going to be able to do all the additional things that they tend to do. And then what is your ministry philosophy? Are you very invested in your live stream? Is all your tech pretty bleeding edge? Or are things more basic? Different ministries kind of emphasize different things, and that's going to, I think, influence the decision that you make about a mixing console. But the last one is not to be overlooked, and that is, how are your volunteers? What's your volunteer base? The more complex you make something, the harder it is to train people to run it on a Sunday morning. The simpler you make it, the more volunteers are probably going to be able to use it. There's this tendency, and I see it sometimes in churches with younger pastors, where everything is like very high tech and bleeding edge. And the problem is they don't have volunteers who can run that. And while it's cool and it's all whiz bang, the problem is that their one volunteer who knows how to use it goes on vacation, and there's basically not a live stream, or this is like a bunch of stuff that doesn't happen because that volunteer is not there. And I'm kind of guilty of this in my own ministry. I have a couple things that are maybe more complex than they need to be. And then when I'm out of town, there are times when I have one really reliable volunteer who unfortunately is moving. And so I'm having to look like I need to simplify a couple of these things because I won't have this excellent volunteer who, dots all the I's and crosses all the T's, but I'm going to be in training mode. I may have that volunteer again, in the future with a new person, but people come and go. And so making your tech work for your volunteers is very important. In fact, I would say if you can sacrifice a little bit of complexity and a little bit of maybe extra whiz bang or polish just to make your booth easy for volunteers to run, that's going to make them less stressed out. It's going to make you less stressed out because you can find people who can actually run things. It's going to be better all the way around. The larger your ministry gets, the more you can do that. And maybe at some point you will have a staff member who can run that. And then that's a whole different situation. But even for larger ministries, a lot of times everything runs on volunteers. So consider that when you're buying a mixing console. Well, anyway, I hope that was helpful. And I know there's a lot of things to think through. So I hope I've given you some things to consider, some things to think about. And I'm always happy to consult If you want me to look at something or dig through sort of all the parts of the ministry that you have and say, what should I do? Please feel free to give me a call or visit my website at proclaimav.com. Anyway, that's it for this episode, and I hope I'll see you on the next one.